think we've all seen players like TenZ own on GRIDSHOT and think, man, I wish I could have that kind of aim. But you don't know how to get started, and shooting bots in the training range is starting to feel a little stale. That's why today, we're going to help you train like TenZ. What's up ProGuides fam, it's Royal G, and in this video, we're going to jump into AimLab and take a deeper look at the TenZ training playlist so that you can begin training like a pro player. So with that said, buckle up, like and subscribe, and let's get started. There's tons of scenarios in AimLab, and it's often very hard to decide which ones are best to practice without just testing them out first at random. That's why playlists are really helpful, because players in the community can compile scenarios that they think are good for training and then share them with everyone else. And luckily for us, we've got the cracked aim god TenZ himself to show us the way. But keep in mind, of course, I'm quite confident that TenZ didn't do like hours of research or something to methodically put together this playlist, but having a pro player show us what he thinks is good training is always a great way to get started. Not only that, this playlist scenarios are very fun in my opinion, and having fun is a big part of maintaining that motivation to train to become the best. Let's get into it. So the first scenario in TenZ's playlist is called STRAFE track, and it's basically a scenario where you try to track a moving target with a set speed going left or right. This is sort of like tracking movement in Valorant, where players typically don't go up and down randomly, but only move linearly left and right. I've already done this scenario quite a few times in the past, so it wasn't a surprise to me, but it's also a great scenario to start with, especially since most people know TenZ more for his insane flicks rather than things like tracking. Reading movement is a huge part of playing Valorant, and it would be bad to assume that you won't need at least some level of tracking to play well. With that being said, an insight that I think is pretty important for tracking is that it's not all about reaction speed. There's a lot of mental aspects that you need to build to really feel comfortable tracking a game, like understanding how they can move, what the speed and trajectory will be, and when they'll likely stop. Strafe track is great because the movement is at a set speed and will only go from left to right, making it a lot more realistic and practical. Of course, you still have to react to direction changes, but that's something that all tracking scenarios will have to some extent, unless they're simply swinging in one direction. Which takes us to the second scenario, motion track. This one also practices tracking, but it also adds in a mix of flicking as well. When you shoot the center target, a second target spawns that moves in a set direction. I'll be honest, as soon as I started this scenario, I knew I was getting some good stuff because I always wanted a scenario like this, but I just didn't know if it existed or not. Sometimes you just don't know how to look for what you want, and the names aren't exactly the most representative of what goes on in a scenario until you try them out. But anyways, this scenario is super relevant for Valorant in-game, and there are tons of situations where you have to track a target, then flick to another, or shoot at a target and then flick to a moving target or whatever. Basically, if you want to be well-rounded with both flicks and tracking in a practical sense, this scenario is surprisingly good at mimicking in-game situations. So this one builds good muscle memory for switching between flicks and tracking, and that could save you in a crazy situation in-game. And if that didn't convince you to try out TenZ playlist and download AimLab, I gotta let you know that AimLab is the best free aim trainer around. Not only are their playlists curated by pros like TenZ, Valorant even partnered up with AimLab to create some scenarios tailored specifically for us gamers in mind. So if you're on the fence about training your aim like a pro, don't be. Click the link in the description and get ahead of the competition today. Next up, we have a different version of the classic SPIDERSHOT that people like to use, and that's to add a 180 flick in between shots. Basically, for SPIDERSHOT 180, you're playing SPIDERSHOT except you have to turn around every time you break the outer target. While this isn't the most relevant to in-game situations because you technically don't need to constantly turn around, it still has some great uses. First of all, it introduces a 180 in the practice so that you can get used to spinning around if necessary, and secondly, it makes you comfortable with bigger turns and resetting to immediately flick again. One insight that's important here is that you don't need to hit a perfect 180 every time like a robot, but when you flick around, you want to be comfortable enough to make a micro flick right after. So turning around is actually two parts, the big adjustment, then the micro adjustment to actually shoot the target. And after that, we start entering some really fun scenarios, with the first being MULTISHOT. I think most people know GRIDSHOT, but not as many people have seen MULTISHOT before, even though they're quite similar. You have targets that spawn, but each target sort of gets bigger to a point and then starts shrinking until it disappears. So the goal is to sort of follow along with the targets as they spawn, because if you can keep up your speed, then it's obviously easier to hit bigger targets. I think this is a really fun scenario, especially if you can keep up with your own pace, but it's also really hectic if you lose track of what's happening, since all the targets are at different stages of shrinking. So you have to think quickly while also aiming quickly. Although this isn't as good as GRIDSHOT in my opinion, it's a fun challenge that I think also builds your internal clock well because it forces you to constantly judge how comfortable you are with taking certain shots, knowing the target shrinks more the longer you take. And before we continue, let's have our question of the day. How much time do you spend every week on aim trainers? Personally, I spend around 3 to 4 hours every week, which evens to about 30 minutes a day. I'm not the most consistent with training specifically on AimLab, but there are times where I spend like 2 hours just going hard on 1 or 2 scenarios trying to push my scores or train a specific skill set. Let me know how much time you dedicate to AimLab in the comments below, and maybe also tell me your favorite scenario too. Next up, we have Motion Shot Speed, which is a very fast-paced scenario centered around quick flicks. This one is tailored towards speed, so the targets are pretty big but also disappear quickly, so you have to be confident with your general flicks. I think this is a pretty good scenario to train your reactions in game, because you might have to make flicks onto a target swinging you close, and if you're not fast enough, you could end up dying. Flicking like this is usually an underrated skill in game because it doesn't look precise, but in reality, it can make a big difference for sight anchors holding down a sight or an entry trying to burst into one. Being able to quickly flick between targets up close is just as important as being precise at range, so this is definitely useful as practice. After the speed version, there's the precision version that continues with the same idea but obviously scales it to be more about precision rather than just speed. So in this case, the targets are smaller, but there's more time to react. I think I already covered how this scenario can be important for in-game situations, but this one is just tailored more towards the mid-range rather than up close. At the same time, this isn't exactly the same as the speed version because this focuses a little more on recognizing the movement and either flicking to a position that you know it will reach soon and timing your click, or being able to quickly flick onto the target and track it. So depending on how you want to approach it, you can practice more flicks or more tracking. This is honestly like a hybrid of SPIDERSHOT and motion track, and encompasses a lot of the skills you need to perform well in both of those. And this is where I personally was super surprised, because the next scenario has something to do with a super underrated skill in FPS tactical shooters, which is reacting to audio information. I'm not gonna lie, after doing this scenario a couple times, I've come to the conclusion that I'm incapable of determining what's in front of me and what's behind me. And that sort of makes sense, because it's pretty hard to create a difference in sound for something in front and something behind. Although this isn't nearly as hard in a game like Valorant because you can hear different materials and you have the minimap or other informational cues, it's still a pretty important skill to practice if you want to remain attentive during a clutch or even during hectic rounds where comms are all over the place. Anyways, I wouldn't consider this to be particularly fast-paced or fun, but it's definitely something to think about when training, as not everything is about aim. And after that, we have another skill that isn't necessarily aim, but is something that helps in basically everything we do, which is our reaction speed. In this scenario called Detection, you're basically just playing the human benchmark by shooting whenever you see a target shows up on the screen. I think we can all agree that reaction speed is a huge part of Valorant and that faster reaction times directly affect our success in game, or at the very least, our potential at the moment. Not to say that a slow reaction speed means you can't be good, but that assuming 2 players of equal skill, whoever has the faster reaction speed will generally have an advantage. One thing that I think people mistake too often though is that reaction speed is completely genetic and that you can't train it or improve on it at all. But as a guy who started off his FPS journey with a 250 millisecond reaction time that's now at 150 milliseconds, that is simply not true. I read before that what actually improves as you train is reflexes, which is supposedly separate from reaction time, but I'm not a sports doctor, so don't take my word for it. But considering that I'm basically a boomer in Valorant at 23 with a reaction time like 40% faster than I was when I was 18, you can definitely train your reactions to become faster. And of course, to finish the playlist, we have to have the scenario that TenZ is famous for, which is GRIDSHOT. There's always something really fun about just shooting a bunch of targets quickly, and GRIDSHOT definitely fits the bill with that. A lot of people think GRIDSHOT's not useful for training, but I think that there's a lot to learn from GRIDSHOT. Not only do you have to be quick and accurate, you also have to keep track of your internal rhythm by judging how accurate or comfortable you feel at the moment. A tip that I think is really important that we covered in a past video is to treat GRIDSHOT like you're breathing. If you're feeling comfortable while shooting, try to speed up without missing, and if you feel yourself slipping, try to slow down to regain control. Whatever you do, I suggest that you don't use a metronome or a set beat to play to, because in-game, you don't get to set the pace very often, and your opponents don't really peak to a 220 beats per minute metronome. It's all about reacting and judging your internal rhythm, and that's the most important part. Anyways, after GRIDSHOT, the playlist is completed, and you've just finished the TenZ playlist on AimLab. While it's nothing revolutionary, this playlist is not only a great way to get started practicing, but also has some really relevant material for improving in Valorant and building your aim up to a solid level. With that said, it's been Royal G, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't, and good luck on the grind.